There was something strange about the way Aniello Dellacroce sat alone in the dark, even when the world around him begged for light. His men never asked questions. They knew better. In the underworld, silence wasn't weakness, it was power. And Aniello had a silence that could make the bravest man fold in half. But what they didn't know was that Aniello didn't sit in the dark for control. He sat there because sleep had abandoned him years ago. Not a single night passed without those eyes, bloodshot, accusing, lifeless, floating just above him. Not a single breath came easy without the sound of someone whispering his name, like a curse in the shadows. He hadn't always been like that. In the old days, when he first started collecting envelopes and breaking bones for the boss, he could rest his head on a bar booth and snore like a baby. But after the third body he buried with his own hands, one of them still warm, sleep stopped coming. He tried everything: expensive mattresses, sound machines, whiskey, pills, confession, even a crooked priest from Red Hook who promised to cleanse his soul for $10,000 and a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue. Nothing worked. The only thing that helped, just a little, was not being alone. That's why he kept Tommy the Kid around. Tommy wasn't much, a shaky driver with an uneven shave and a dumb laugh, but he didn't ask questions. He played cards with Aniello at 2 a.m. when the Don couldn't lie still. He made bad jokes. He poured the scotch without shaking. And he never mentioned the noises from Aniello's room. One night, Tommy asked soft and slow, like someone asking about a funeral, "You okay, boss? You've been walking around the house talking to yourself." Aniello didn't look at him. "I don't talk to myself," he said. Tommy nodded like a puppet, but Aniello did talk. Not to himself, to them. To the ones who didn't walk anymore. The ones who never made it out of that warehouse on Flatbush. The ones buried in unmarked dirt behind that Jersey motel. And especially to Frankie Blue Eyes Rizzo, his first real betrayal. Frankie was more than just a hit. He was Aniello's blood brother in this thing. They came up together, took their first beatings from the same men, swore loyalty to the same boss, ate dinner at each other's houses. Their mothers knew each other by name. But Frankie got greedy, started running numbers behind the family's back, fed information to the feds, thinking he was too slick to get caught. When Aniello found out, he didn't cry, he didn't even blink. He just walked Frankie out behind the butcher shop and shot him once in the stomach. Not the head, not the chest, the stomach. Made him bleed out slow, long enough to ask why. "I loved you," Frankie had whispered. "I know," Aniello had said before pulling the trigger again. "But love don't mean shit when you're in this world." Now, all these years later, it was Frankie's voice that came back the loudest in the middle of the night. "You remember me, Neil?" the voice would say. "You remember what you did?" Aniello would wake up with his fists clenched, drenched in sweat, breathing like a man drowning. One night, it got worse. He swore that Frankie was standing in the corner of his bedroom, arms crossed, head tilted. "You sleep in silk sheets now," Frankie said, "but you ain't never gonna be warm." Aniello pulled his gun from under the pillow and fired. Bang, bang, bang. Tommy ran in, heart pounding, shirt half buttoned. The wall was full of holes. No body, no blood, just the sound of Aniello breathing like an animal. That night, Tommy called Carlo, the boss. "I think Mr. Dellacroce is losing it," he said. "He's talking to ghosts." But Carlo didn't answer, because Carlo had already seen it too, that thing in Aniello's eyes. Something wasn't right with him. Something had crawled in and made a home inside him, feeding on all the death he left behind. And in this business, when a man starts talking in his sleep, he's not long for this world. The sun had barely broken through the thick Manhattan smog when Aniello stepped out into the street. He wore the same black wool coat he'd been wearing for years, the same fedora pulled low over his eyes. Everything about him looked exactly the same as it had in the 70s, like he was frozen in time. But inside, he was rotting. He hadn't slept a full night in weeks now. And when he did fall asleep for an hour or two, it was always the same. Frankie's voice, the feel of the blood on his hands, the sound of that slow dying breath in the alleyway, like air escaping a broken balloon. It followed him everywhere. In the shower, he thought he saw shadows slipping past the curtain. In the steam on the mirror, he swore he saw writing. Traitor, murderer, you're next. When he closed his eyes to shave, he could almost feel someone behind him. But Aniello Dellacroce wasn't the type of man to go see a shrink. No, he had a different solution in mind. That morning, he told Tommy to drive him to the old neighborhood, the East Village, back where the streets still remembered his name, where store owners still nodded with two hands, not one, and kids still crossed to the other side of the street when he passed by. They stopped in front of a narrow brick building with boarded-up windows and a metal gate. Inside was a man they called Father Carmine, though he hadn't set foot inside a real church in over 20 years. Carmine had been defrocked after misplacing some donation money and getting caught in a hotel with a woman who wasn't exactly there for spiritual healing. But the old man still wore black, still spoke Latin, and most importantly, he kept his mouth shut. Aniello didn't knock. He just walked in, letting the door slam behind him like thunder. Carmine looked up from his folding chair, one eye milky with cataract, the other sharp as ever. "Well, well," he said, voice raspy like gravel, "the dead man walking returns." Aniello didn't answer. He sat down, slow, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. He didn't even notice they were shaking. "I got ghosts," he said finally. Carmine raised an eyebrow. "You? You got ghosts?" He chuckled. "I thought you were the one who made ghosts." "That's the problem," Aniello muttered. "They all remember me." There was a long silence. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Inside, the room felt colder than it should have been. Carmine leaned forward. "You want me to pray for you?" "No," Aniello said. "I want you to tell me what the fuck is happening to me." Carmine studied him, eyes narrowing. "You ever see the devil, Aniello?" "I've been the devil." "Yeah," Carmine whispered. "I know. That's why he's come to collect." Aniello flinched just for a second. Then the anger came. "Don't play games with me, old man." "I'm not." Carmine's voice was calm. "You lived your life by the gun. You made your bones before most kids learned how to spell. You killed men who trusted you, who loved you, and you did it with a cold heart. Now you're surprised that their faces follow you." "I did what I had to do," Aniello growled. "I protected the family." "Whose family?" Carmine shot back. "Carlo's, the Gambinos? What about the ones who bled out in your arms? What about Frankie?" The name hit like a slap. "Don't say his name. Or why not?" Carmine leaned in. "He says yours, every night." Aniello stood suddenly, knocking over the chair. His chest heaved. The cigarette burning between his fingers, the ashes falling on the floor. "I should kill you," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You've already killed everything else." That was the last straw. Aniello stormed out, slamming the door so hard the window cracked. He didn't even wait for Tommy to open the car door. He drove himself, speeding down the narrow streets like a man chased by death itself. And maybe he was. That night, the dreams came worse than before. He was back in that alley behind the butcher's shop. Frankie stood there again, just like always. But this time, he wasn't bleeding. He was laughing. "Ain't it funny?" Frankie said, his blue eyes glowing like headlights. "You did all this for power, and now you're afraid of the dark." Aniello tried to lift his gun, but his arms wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Frankie walked closer, his smile rotting into a sneer. "You remember the kid in Bensonhurst?" Frankie hissed. "The one you stabbed because he wouldn't pay protection?" Aniello's throat was dry. His knees buckled. "I remember all of them," Frankie whispered, "and they remember you." Suddenly, there were more faces, a whole crowd of them, broken jaws, slashed throats, hollow eyes, reaching, grabbing, pulling him down into the dirt. Aniello screamed. He woke up on the floor, drenched in sweat, the sheets torn, the lamp shattered. Tommy burst in again, panting. Boss, what the hell?" Aniello shoved him hard. "Get out!" Tommy backed up fast, hands in the air, eyes wide. Okay? Aniello sat there, breathing like a man fresh out of the grave. This had to stop. He couldn't keep going like this. The walls were closing in. The ghosts were getting louder. He could barely tell reality from memory anymore. But what he didn't know was that someone else had already noticed. Carlo Gambino wasn't a man who took risks. He didn't rise to the top of the family by being sloppy. And right now, Aniello Dellacroce was a liability. A once loyal soldier who was cracking at the seams. So Carlo called a meeting. 4 men sat around a long table in the back of a bakery in Brooklyn. The sweet smell of cannoli and almond flour couldn't mask the tension in the air. "He's losing it," Carlo said flatly. "You all know it." "He still commands respect," one capo said. "Guys won't cross him." "They don't have to," Carlo replied. "If he snaps and starts running his mouth, we're all dead." There was silence. Then, from the end of the table, a voice. "I'll take care of it." It was Joey Vento, the ice-hearted enforcer from Queens, the kind of man who smiled during hits and never asked questions. Joey had done time, buried bodies, and earned his bones in ways that still made people wince. Carlo nodded once. "Make it clean. Make it quiet." Joey smirked. He won't feel a thing. But Joey didn't know what he was walking into. Aniello had killed too many men to not feel when something was off. And that night, as he sat on his leather couch with the TV playing static and a glass of bourbon shaking in his hand, he felt it. A shadow behind the curtain, a step that didn't belong. He reached for his pistol under the cushion, not fast, not loud, just instinct. Then he waited. Joey stepped out from the hallway, silencer in hand, calm as ever. "Hey, Neil," he said casual. Aniello didn't even blink. "Joey, you know why I'm here." "I got a guess." Joey raised the gun. "You gonna fight?" Aniello looked down at his drink, then at the wall, then at the mirror. He didn't see himself anymore. Just Frankie. Just blood. "No," Aniello said quietly. "Do what you came to do." Joey hesitated. That wasn't the reaction he expected, but he aimed anyway. Just as his finger tensed, bang! The shot wasn't his. Joey fell backward, a hole in his forehead, eyes wide in shock. Tommy stood behind him, holding a smoking revolver with both hands, shaking like a leaf. Aniello turned, eyes bloodshot. He stared at Tommy for a long, long time. I had to," Tommy stuttered. "I heard the noise. I saw the gun. Aniello stood slowly, walked over, and took the gun from him. "Thank you," he said, but his eyes were dead. He looked down at Joey's body, then at the wall, then at his hands. Frankie's voice came again, low and cold. "You're still not clean, Neil." Aniello dropped into the chair like his bones had given up, and for the first time, he whispered something not to the ghosts, but to himself. "I think I'm already dead." The body of Joey Vento was still warm when Tommy finally sat down. His knees gave out halfway, and he dropped into the corner armchair like he'd been shot, too. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stared at them, blinking like a man who didn't understand what just happened. "I killed him," he whispered. "Jesus, I killed him." Aniello didn't look at him. He just stared at Joey's corpse, sprawled out on the rug like a piece of broken furniture. A dark red halo bloomed under his head. "You saved my life," Aniello said, voice low. "I didn't think... Aniello finally turned. His eyes, hollow and bloodshot, locked onto Tommy like a weight. "You think I'm gonna thank you?" Tommy's mouth opened, then closed. Aniello stood up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and pulled out a bottle of bourbon. He poured a glass to the rim, then downed it in one go. No ice, no words. "You just signed your death certificate," Aniello muttered. Tommy blinked fast. I was just trying to help." "Help?" Aniello scoffed. "You think this is some fucking Disney movie? You kill a maid guy and think the family's gonna give you a medal? I saved you." "You saved a ghost," Aniello snapped. "I'm already gone. You should have let him finish the job." Tommy stood now, angry. "Don't say that. You're not gone. You're still Aniello fucking Dellacroce. Everyone's still scared of you." Aniello slammed the glass against the sink, shattering it. "They're not scared of me," he growled. "They're scared of what I remind them of, what they've done, what they'll become. I'm a walking mirror full of dead faces." Tommy didn't know what to say to that. He looked down at Joey's body again and felt the bile rise in his throat. "We need to get rid of him," Tommy said finally, "before anyone finds out." Aniello stared at him for a long time. He didn't answer. Then he nodded. They wrapped Joey in a tarp from the garage, taped it tight, and shoved him into the trunk of Aniello's old Lincoln. It took nearly an hour. Joey was heavy and stiffening fast. Tommy kept gagging. Aniello said nothing the whole time, like he was in a trance. They drove out to Montauk, where the sea met the rocks and the fog was thick enough to swallow a body whole. Aniello knew a spot, a cliffside construction site that had been abandoned after the city ran out of money. No one ever went there anymore. They dumped Joey in the gravel pit behind the old shack. Aniello didn't even say a prayer, just lit a cigarette and looked up at the stars. "You believe in hell, Tommy?" he asked quietly. Tommy glanced over, startled. I don't know, maybe." "I do," Aniello said, "because I've been living in it since '78. Tommy looked at him. "What happened in '78? Aniello didn't answer. He turned away, flicked his cigarette into the wind, and walked back to the car. Back in the city, word was spreading. Joey had gone missing, last seen heading toward Aniello's place. That raised questions, and questions turned into whispers. And whispers in this world could get a man killed just as fast as a bullet. Carlo Gambino got the call 2 days later while eating breakfast. His face didn't change. He just wiped his hands with a linen napkin and said, "Get me Salvatore and Vinny. Now." Sal and Vinny were his cleanup crew. They didn't ask why. They just nodded, grabbed their coats, and got in the car. Meanwhile, Aniello sat in the same living room chair he'd been in since the night of the shooting. Same position, same drink. Only difference now, he wasn't alone. Frankie was back. "You can bury a body," Frankie said, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the couch like a talk show guest. "But you can't bury a mistake." Aniello didn't flinch anymore. He didn't scream or aim guns at shadows. He just stared. "I did what I had to," he muttered. Frankie smiled. "I know. But now someone else is going to do what they have to." Aniello looked at him. "They send you to warn me?" Frankie's smile faded. "No, they didn't send me. You called me." "What the hell does that mean?" "You built your life on blood and secrets," Frankie said, standing now, pacing. "But secrets rot, and blood don't wash out. You brought me here. Every face you ever saw die. You called them back, one by one." Aniello closed his eyes. "So what happens now?" "You finish what you started," Frankie whispered. "You clean it." The next day, Aniello made a call to Carlo. "I know what happened to Joey," he said, calm, flat. Carlo didn't respond. There was silence on the other end. "I know you sent him, and I don't blame you. I'm not right in the head anymore. I get it." Still nothing. "But you should know something, Carlo," Aniello continued. "I got nothing left to lose. You want me gone? You send more men, but don't expect them to come back." He hung up. That afternoon, Tommy came back from the store to find Aniello packing a small bag. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Upstate," Aniello said. "Cabin near Lake George. Need to get off the grid." "Is it safe?" "No, but it's quiet. That's all I care about now." Tommy nodded. He looked down at the revolver on the table, the same one that killed Joey. "You think they'll come?" Aniello looked out the window. "They have to." They left that night. No lights, no phone calls, just the open road, the smell of pine, and the silence between two men bound by something more than loyalty, shared guilt. As they drove, Tommy kept glancing at Aniello, who stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the dark road. "Can I ask you something?" Tommy said after an hour. "Yeah." "Who was the first?" Aniello was quiet for a long time. The road twisted through woods, fog rolling low along the pavement. Then he said, "A kid named Benny." "What did he do?" Aniello sighed. "Stole a car. Didn't know it belonged to a maid guy. They told me to make an example." "Jesus," Tommy whispered. "He cried," Aniello said. "Begged. I still hear it sometimes, in my sleep, before all the others started showing up." Tommy didn't speak again after that. By midnight, they reached the cabin. It was quiet, isolated, no one for miles, just the sound of crickets, wind in the trees, and a stillness that pressed against your chest. Aniello took the main room. Tommy locked all the doors and loaded the revolver again, but sleep still wouldn't come. Because Aniello was hearing voices again, this time not just Frankie. He heard Benny. "You were just a soldier," Benny said softly from the window, "but you still had a choice." Aniello sat up, sweating. "I never had a choice," he muttered. Benny didn't reply. He just watched. Then others appeared in the doorway, all of them, faces twisted, bodies broken, eyes empty. They didn't speak. They just stared. Aniello collapsed to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it." But no one answered. Back in the city, Carlo got the report. Aniello had vanished, Tommy with him. But Joey was still gone too. And now it wasn't just about cleaning up a mess. It was about sending a message. He called Vinny and Sal back in. "Find them," Carlo said, "and this time, make it loud." The cabin was deathly quiet in the morning. No birds, no breeze, not even the sound of branches creaking. Just a strange stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. Aniello sat on the porch, staring out at the trees with a cigarette in one hand and a revolver in the other. He hadn't slept, not a wink. Again. But that wasn't news anymore. Tommy stepped outside, his hoodie wrinkled, face pale. "You sleep at all?" Aniello didn't even blink. Didn't plan to. Tommy rubbed his face. "You really think Carlo's gonna send someone way up here?" Aniello flicked ash off the edge of the porch. "He already has. Whether it's today or next week, someone's coming." Tommy sat down on the step, folding his arms. "We can leave, disappear. New names, new lives. Maybe go down to Florida. I got a cousin in Hialeah, owns a restaurant. Nobody knows us down there." Aniello smirked without smiling. "You don't get to disappear when you've bled this many people, Tommy. Doesn't matter if you move to Florida or fucking Mars. You carry it all with you." Tommy didn't argue. He didn't need to. He could see it on Aniello's face. The old man was already gone. Not physically, but his soul had been hollowed out by everything he'd done. It was like watching a man walk around wearing a dead man's skin. And it scared him. Not because Aniello was dangerous. He was, of course. But not like before. What scared Tommy now was that Aniello wasn't afraid of dying anymore. Back in the city, Vinny and Sal had just gotten the word. Find Aniello, end it, and make it loud. Carlo's instructions were crystal clear. No more quiet hits, no more polite send-offs. The man had ignored an order, killed a maid guy, even if it was in self-defense, and then vanished. Now people were talking, and talking led to rumors, and in the Cosa Nostra, rumors were poison. Vinny tapped a long ash off his cigar and leaned back in the booth of a dark Brooklyn steakhouse. "Guy's got balls," he muttered. "Disappears with a rat-faced driver, kills Joey, and thinks he can ride out the storm." Sal, who looked like he'd been carved out of rawhide and regret, sipped his espresso slow. "He's not hiding," Sal said. "He's waiting." Vinny raised an eyebrow. "Waiting for what?" Sal shrugged. "Judgment? Death? Ghosts? Who knows? You ever seen a man go soft in the head like that? Start seeing things that ain't there?" Vinny blew smoke from his nose. "Yeah, my old man, right before he shot himself." They both sat in silence for a second. Then Vinny said, "Lake George. That's where we start." Sal nodded once. They paid the check and left the city. That night in the cabin, Aniello did something Tommy hadn't seen him do in weeks. He talked, not about death, not about ghosts, but about before. "Back in the old days," Aniello began, "we used to run numbers through a pizza shop in Carroll Gardens. Angelo was the guy, owned the place, had the best calzones you ever tasted." Tommy listened, carefully. He knew these stories weren't just small talk. Everyone was a confession wrapped in nostalgia. One day this guy comes in, tries to short us on collections, says his kid's in the hospital, medical bills. We let it slide the first week. Second week we gave him a warning. Third week I broke his fingers with a garlic press. Tommy cringed. "Jesus." Aniello laughed, but it was a dry, brittle sound. "Yeah, Jesus had nothing to do with it." There was a long pause. Do you regret it? Tommy asked. Aniello didn't answer right away. Then softly, I regret that I didn't stop when I could have. That there was a time I could have walked away and I didn't. You get used to the power, the way people look at you, like you're untouchable. And then, one day, you wake up and realize everyone you ever knew is either dead, in jail, or hates you. Tommy said nothing, just watched the old man's eyes drift to the window again, like he was expecting someone, and someone was coming. Vinny and Sal had reached the edge of the Adirondacks by nightfall. They were pros. No loud cars, no paper trails, no phones, just maps, cash, and 2 silencers tucked under their coats. By midnight, they were camped a mile from the cabin, eyes on the road, binoculars out. He's in there, Vinny whispered. Sal nodded. You sure? I saw the Lincoln parked behind the trees. Nobody else drives that boat. Sal exhaled slowly. All right, we go at dawn. Back inside the cabin, Aniello was standing in the kitchen, making a pot of coffee like it was any other day. You ever wonder, he said, voice quiet, if some men are just born cursed? Tommy looked up from the couch. What do you mean? Aniello poured 2 cups. His hands were surprisingly steady. I mean, some guys get out. They do the same things we did, maybe worse. But they live. They forget. They move on. But some of us, he looked down at the coffee. Some of us bring it all with us, like luggage. You carry every scream, every drop of blood, and eventually it drags you under. He handed Tommy a cup. You're young, he added. You could still drop the bag. Tommy shook his head. I already opened it. Aniello gave him a strange look, one part proud, one part sad. He nodded once. Then he walked over to the bookshelf, slid out an old copy of Don Quixote, and behind it, a .38 snubbed nose. He tucked it into his waistband, then sat down by the door. They'll be here by morning. The sun began to rise, faint and blood orange through the trees. Sal clicked the safety off his pistol. Let's move. They crept toward the cabin like wolves in fog. Inside, Aniello didn't flinch when the first step creaked outside. He simply stood up and walked to the center of the living room. Tommy raised the revolver, heart pounding. You sure you want to be here for this? Aniello asked. Tommy nodded. You saved me more than once. I'm not leaving you now. Aniello gave a tiny, crooked smile. Then the door exploded open. Vinny came in first. Bang! The first shot hit him in the shoulder, from Tommy. Vinny fell back screaming, pistol skidding across the floor. Sal rushed in next, gun raised. Aniello moved faster than a man his age should have been able to. Bang! Sal crumpled. Tommy stood frozen, smoke drifting from his gun. Vinny groaned from the floor, bleeding heavy. Aniello walked over and pointed his gun straight at Vinny's head. But he didn't pull the trigger. He just stared. I used to think I was better than men like you, Aniello said. Cleaner, smarter, but I was just louder, just colder. You think you're a soldier? You're a dog, Vinny. Doing tricks for a master who'll bury you the second you limp. Vinny didn't answer, just bled. Aniello turned away. Tommy followed him outside, dazed. That's it? He asked. Aniello lit a cigarette with shaking hands. No, he said. That's the beginning. Back in the city, Carlo heard the news from a trembling associate with blood on his collar. Vinny, wounded, Sal, dead. Aniello, still breathing. Carlo sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He's going to start a war, his consigliere said. Carlo shook his head. No, he's going to end one. The blood hadn't even dried on the cabin floor when Tommy pulled the curtains shut and slid down the wall, chest rising fast. You think there's more coming? He asked, voice tight with fear. Aniello stood over the sink, washing his hands. He didn't answer right away. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. He shut it off and looked out the kitchen window. They'll come, he said, but not like Vinny and Sal. Next time, it'll be political. Tommy frowned. What the hell does that mean? It means Carlo knows now that I won't go down quiet. Next move won't be bullets. It'll be meetings, pressure. He'll try to corner me into retirement, make me step down, disappear with dignity. And if you don't? Aniello looked at him with eyes that had seen every shade of betrayal this life could offer. Then the commission gets involved, and they make it ugly. By mid-afternoon, Vinny had been taken to a crooked doctor in Yonkers. Bullet went clean through his shoulder, missed the artery. He was pale, groggy, and pissed, but alive. Carlo didn't visit him. Instead, he sat in a back room of a social club in Bensonhurst with 3 other capos and Paul Castellano, the next in line and Carlo's chosen successor. "He's not going to stop," Paul said, swirling his espresso like it insulted him. "He's old," another capo shrugged. "Let him rot up there in the woods. Ghosts will kill him faster than we can." "No," Carlo muttered. "He killed Joey. He shot Sal. He wounded Vinny. Now he's got a kid with him, a driver, Tommy. Nobody special, but he's loyal. Too loyal. That means Aniello's planning something." Paul leaned back. "Then we smoke him out." Carlo looked at him. "Careful, Paulie. He made you once. He made all of us. You pull the trigger on him, make sure your hand don't shake." Paul didn't flinch. "He's not the man who made me. That man's dead already." Back at the cabin, Aniello was sitting on the porch again. This time, he wasn't holding a drink or a gun. He was holding an envelope. Tommy stepped outside and saw it in his hand. "What's that?" Aniello looked down at it. "A letter." "To who?" Aniello didn't look up. "My daughter." Tommy froze. "You have a daughter?" Aniello finally met his eyes. "I had a life once, Tommy. Before all this. A wife. A baby girl. I used to come home to laughter. I used to smell pasta sauce instead of blood. I used to sleep." "What happened to her?" Aniello took a long breath. "She was 5 when I left. Not because I didn't love her, but because I loved this more. The street, the power, the fear. I told myself I was protecting them. But the truth is, I didn't want them to see who I was becoming. Where is she now? College professor in Vermont, married, 2 kids. Probably tells them their grandfather died in the war, or some noble lie like that." Tommy was quiet for a long time. "You gonna send the letter?" Aniello shook his head. "No. I just wanted to remember how it felt to write something honest." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. That night, they moved the bodies. Vinny's blood had dried like rust in the floorboards. Sal's body had started to smell. They wrapped him in plastic, weighted him down, and dropped him into the deepest part of the lake. Tommy was shaking again when they were done. "That's 3 now." Aniello didn't respond. He just stood on the dock staring at the ripples. "I never thought I'd be the guy cleaning up bodies," Tommy muttered. "I joined this life to make money, get respect, maybe drive a Cadillac someday." Aniello finally turned. "You still can." Tommy looked at him, startled. "You think I'm walking away after all this?" Aniello's eyes were soft in a way Tommy hadn't seen before. "You don't have to follow me, Tommy. You still got a shot. You walk away now, nobody will blame you. Hell, they'll probably forget you. That's a blessing in this world." Tommy didn't answer, just walked back to the cabin in silence. The next morning, Tommy found Aniello in the shed, building something. "What the hell's that?" Aniello didn't look up. "A coffin." Tommy blinked. "For who?" Aniello picked up a hammer. "Me." Tommy stood frozen. "You planning to die soon?" Aniello didn't stop working. "I'm planning to be prepared." Tommy shook his head. "You really think this ends with you in the dirt?" Aniello finally looked at him. "No, Tommy, I know it." In New York, Paul Castellano had called a vote. The room was packed with power. Capos, underbosses, consiglieres, everyone who mattered. Everyone who'd once respected or feared Aniello Dellacroce. "We have a problem," Paul began. "Aniello has gone rogue. He's killed 2 men, disobeyed direct orders. He's unstable, paranoid. He's putting all of us at risk." Murmurs rippled through the room. One capo spoke up. "But he's old school. He earned his place." Paul's voice rose. And now he's lost his mind. He's talking to ghosts, for Christ's sake. You want a madman making decisions for this family? Another voice. Carlo, what do you say? Carlo sat silent. His face was gray, hard, but behind his eyes something flickered. Regret, pain, loyalty. I say, we give him one last chance, Carlo said softly. He comes in, we talk. If he doesn't, then we make it right. Paul didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. 2 days later, a black car pulled up to the cabin. Aniello was waiting outside. Tommy stood on the porch, gun in hand, but the man who stepped out wasn't a shooter. It was Carlo. He walked slow, shoulders heavier than they used to be. Aniello nodded at him. You look older, Carlo smirked. You look like hell. They sat at the porch table. No bodyguards, no guns drawn. Just two men who once ran the city, now sitting in the woods like ghosts of their own era. You've made a mess, Carlo said. I know. You could have just gone quietly. I couldn't. There's too many voices now. Carlo looked at him. You seeing them again? Aniello didn't flinch. They never left. Carlo nodded slowly. You want forgiveness? No, Aniello said. I want peace. Carlo stood. Then you know what comes next. Aniello stood too. Let me finish one more thing. Then I'll come back with you. No fight. No blood. Carlo stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. 3 days, he said. Then you come home. He got in the car and left. Aniello watched the taillights disappear into the trees. Tommy stepped beside him. What now? Aniello looked up at the sky. Now, he said softly, we settle the score with the only man who ever really hurt me. Tommy frowned. Who? Aniello whispered. Me. The air in the woods had changed. It was colder now, not from weather, but from something else, something invisible but heavy. Like the trees themselves had heard the conversation between Aniello and Carlo, and now they were just waiting for the last page to turn. Back inside the cabin, Aniello stood over the small wooden box he'd built in the shed, the rough coffin. He ran his fingers over the splinters, the seams. He hadn't sanded it, hadn't polished it, hadn't made it pretty. He didn't see the point. Death wasn't supposed to be pretty. It was supposed to be what it was, raw, sharp, permanent. Tommy leaned against the doorframe behind him, arms crossed. So, what now? Aniello didn't turn. You ever hear about the Castellamarese War? Tommy shook his head. No. Back in the 30s, Aniello said, still staring at the box. The Mafia wasn't like it is now. It was chaos. Two sides tearing each other apart for control of the city. People died in barbershops, churches, even at their own weddings. It was blood every day. He turned finally, eyes sunken and distant. I was just a kid, 16. I watched a man get gunned down in front of a fruit stand over a rumor. That was the day I realized something. This life don't care about truth, just power. Perception. Who gets to speak last? Tommy nodded slowly, absorbing it. I remember my first job, he said after a while. Picking up protection from a diner in Astoria. I was 19. Guy gave me an envelope and a cup of coffee like I was just some delivery boy. Aniello raised an eyebrow. Did you feel powerful? I felt important, Tommy said, like I mattered. Aniello gave a dry laugh. Yeah, that's how it starts. But eventually, it all turns into one big funeral procession. You forget who you were before it. And by the time you want out, you're dragging too many coffins behind you. There was a long silence. Tommy looked down at the box. You really think you're gonna die here? Aniello didn't answer. Later that evening, Aniello pulled out a small black book from his duffel bag. The cover was cracked. Old leather. Looked like it had been opened and shut 1,000 times. Tommy watched him from across the room. What is that? Aniello sat at the table and opened the book. Inside, pages were filled with tiny names scribbled in fading ink. Ledger, Aniello said. From my early days. Every name I ever hurt, taxed, threatened, or buried. Tommy moved closer, curiosity mixed with discomfort. Why would you keep something like that? Aniello didn't look up. Because I never wanted to forget what it cost. He flipped through the pages slowly, almost reverently. Some names had dates next to them, others had nothing, just the memory. He stopped at one name. Emilio Donati, he said aloud. Tommy frowned. Who's that? Aniello stared at the name like it was still alive. A shoemaker, had a little shop on Mott Street. Used to patch my old man's boots for free when we were broke. Quiet guy, no family, kept to himself. One day we found out he was letting one of the Irish guys run a numbers game out of his back room. I was told to make an example. Tommy held his breath. I broke both his knees with a tire iron, Aniello said flatly. Didn't even say a word. Just walked in and started swinging. Tommy closed his eyes. He didn't scream, Aniello continued, voice almost hollow now. Not once. Just looked up at me with this disappointed face, like he'd expected better. He shut the book and let it sit on the table. I never saw him again, but I still hear his bones snapping in my sleep. Tommy didn't know what to say. How could you respond to something like that? You think telling me all this will help? He asked quietly. Aniello nodded. Not you. Me. That night, Aniello left the cabin without a word. Tommy woke up and found the place empty, the front door swinging in the cold wind. He panicked, threw on a jacket, grabbed the revolver, and followed the dirt trail down to the lake. Aniello stood at the edge of the dock, barefoot, staring down at the water. The moon made his silhouette look like something carved from stone. You gonna jump? Tommy called out, half joking, half serious. Aniello didn't turn. I came here once, years ago, he said, before I made my bones. I was just muscle then, running errands, breaking fingers. Carlo brought me here for a weekend to test my loyalty. Tommy came closer. What did he do? Aniello smiled, but it was a sad thing. He handed me a gun and pointed to a guy tied up in a rowboat. Said the guy was skimming off the top. I asked what he wanted me to do. He said, row him out and make sure he doesn't row back. Tommy swallowed hard. I did it, Aniello said. No questions, no hesitation. He looked down at the water again. But I remember thinking, that night, if the world had been just a little different, maybe I would have been the guy in the boat. He turned to Tommy finally. Don't let this life pick your ending for you. Tommy didn't reply. He just nodded. And silently, they both walked back to the cabin. The next morning, Carlo called again. 3 days were up. You ready? Carlo asked over the line. Aniello sat on the edge of his bed, the black book in his lap. No, he said, but I'm coming. Carlo paused. Alone? No, with the kid. That a good idea? He's earned it. Carlo didn't push. We'll meet in Staten Island, the old marina. You know the place? Aniello nodded. I know it. The drive back to the city was quiet. Tommy drove. Aniello stared out the window. Occasionally he wrote something in the book. Not names, letters. A, B, C. Tommy glanced over. What are you doing? Aniello smiled faintly. Just thinking. When they reached Staten Island, the marina was empty. Fog curled around the docks like lazy smoke. 2 black cars waited. Carlo stood in front of them, hands behind his back. Paul Castellano stood beside him, arms crossed. Aniello stepped out of the Lincoln slowly. Tommy stayed close behind. Glad you came, Carlo said. Aniello nodded once. I wanted to look you in the eye before it's done, Aniello said. Carlo tilted his head. Done? I'm not asking for mercy, Aniello said. I'm not running. I'm not begging. But I want one thing in return. Paul scoffed. You don't get to negotiate, old man. Aniello didn't look at him. He looked only at Carlo. I want the kid spared, he said. He saved my life. He's not a threat. Let him walk. Carlo stared at him, then turned to Paul. Paul shrugged. He's nobody. Carlo nodded. Fine. Aniello turned to Tommy. Go. Tommy stepped forward, confused. What? No, I'm not leaving you here. You'll have to, Aniello said. This is where it ends for me. You still have pages left. Tommy's eyes stung. You're not really doing this. Aniello placed the black book in his hands. Tell my daughter, he said softly. Tell her I remembered. Tommy gripped the book like it was burning. Aniello turned, walked toward the edge of the dock. Paul raised a pistol, but Carlo stopped him. No, he said. Let him go his way. Aniello looked out over the water. For a moment, everything was silent. Then he said, I hear you, Frankie, and stepped off the dock into the black. Tommy didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the spot where Aniello had disappeared into the water, the cold black lake swallowing him like a curtain closing on the final act of a play nobody clapped for. There was no splash, no fight, just silence, stillness, finality. The book in Tommy's hands felt heavier than it should have. The cracked leather binding, the stained pages full of names and dates and regrets. It was the weight of history, of blood, of everything Aniello had been trying to unload before he stepped off that dock. Paul Castellano was already turning back toward the car, his voice hard and unimpressed. Old man went out like a coward. Couldn't even take a bullet. Carlo didn't reply. He just stood there, watching the lake. Tommy still hadn't moved. Carlo finally turned toward him. He told you to go. So go. Tommy's jaw clenched. His heart was racing. His hands were trembling. Is that it? Tommy said finally. Carlo looked at him with the patience of a man who had outlived many boys like Tommy. Yes. Tommy looked down at the water again. He was loyal to you until the end. Carlo gave a tired nod. I know. That's why I let him choose how it ended. And Joey? Tommy asked. Sal? Carlo's eyes turned to steel. They knew the rules. So did he. So do you. Tommy took a breath and nodded, tucking the ledger under his arm. Then he walked away. Not because Carlo told him to, but because Aniello had. It was a long drive back. Tommy didn't play music. Didn't check his phone. He didn't speak. Just drove north again, away from Staten Island, away from the water, away from the men in black coats who never buried their own. The book sat in the passenger seat beside him. Every once in a while, he'd glance at it. And every time, he swore he could still smell the faint trace of Aniello's cologne, leather, smoke, and something old world and bitter. Halfway through the drive, he pulled off the highway and into a quiet rest stop. It was late. The place was nearly empty. He got out, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, stared at himself in the mirror. He didn't recognize the man looking back. He wasn't the dumb kid driver anymore. Wasn't the wide-eyed errand boy who used to joke his way out of fear. Now, he had blood on his hands. Now, he had memories in his head that wouldn't let him sleep. Now, he had a dead man's ledger. By morning, he was back at the cabin. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. The sheets rumpled, coffee mug still on the porch, the half-finished crossword on the table, as if Aniello had just stepped out for a walk and never came back. Tommy stood in the middle of the living room for a long time. Then, slowly, he sat down and opened the black book. The pages cracked like dry leaves. He flipped past the names he recognized: Rizzo, Donati, Vento. Each one brought a memory, a whisper, a shiver down his spine. But in the back, near the last page, something new. It wasn't a name. It was a list of initials, some with question marks, some with crosses, some underlined, all written in Aniello's sharp, spidery handwriting. And beneath that, a note. If you're reading this, it means I kept my word. I didn't go down in a hail of bullets, didn't beg. I ended it on my terms, but I didn't finish everything. That's yours now. There are 3 people left who still think they're untouchable. They're not. But you have to be careful. The code doesn't protect you anymore. It protects them. You want peace? Burn the roots. Only then will the tree die. Be smarter than I was, or you'll end up where I am, at the bottom of a lake, still hearing voices. A.D. Tommy read the note 5 times, then again, and something in him shifted. For weeks he'd followed Aniello, not just as a driver, but as a shadow, a student, a friend. He'd watched him lose his grip, lose his sleep, lose his mind. But now it all made sense. Aniello hadn't just been running from ghosts. He was trying to warn him, trying to break the chain. But it was too late for Tommy to walk away now. He'd held the gun, he'd buried the bodies, he'd stood in front of killers and lived. He wasn't invisible anymore. 3 days later, Tommy was in the Bronx. The first name on the list, or the first initial rather, was E.S. Through a contact in the neighborhood, he figured out who that meant. Eddie Santucci, old associate, ran guns through the docks back in the 90s, retired from public life after a messy extortion case, but still moved money for the family. Quiet, private, but not innocent. Tommy parked across the street from a diner Eddie was known to visit on Thursdays. He sat in his car, staring, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Could he really do it? Could he follow through? He thought about Aniello's voice. You carry every scream. Tommy got out. Eddie Santucci looked like an aging insurance salesman. Round belly, comb over, glasses too big for his face. He sat at the counter, eating eggs and toast, sipping coffee like a man with no worries. Tommy slid into the booth behind him, waited. When Eddie got up and went to pay, Tommy followed him out. Mr. Santucci, he said. Eddie turned, confused. Do I know? Bang. Silencer. Clean shot. Chest, not the head. Like Aniello used to say, give him enough time to realize what's happening. Eddie dropped like laundry. Tommy didn't run. He walked away calm, got in the car, and drove north again. One down. Back at the cabin, he opened the ledger again. Next name, T.D. That one was harder. Took digging. Old newspaper clippings, cross-checks. Tony DeMarco. A dirty union man turned quiet consultant. Lived in Jersey now. Suburban palace. Laughed at backyard BBQs and still collected his cut-off garbage routes and laundering fronts. Tommy watched his house for 3 nights, watched his routines, watched his wife, his kids. He felt sick to his stomach. But then he remembered Aniello's eyes the night Joey died. The way they had stared at the blood, the way they had said nothing. He waited until Tony left for his morning jog, cornered him by the trail. Tony recognized him. You're Dellacroce's. Bang, 2 down. The ledger grew heavier, not physically, but emotionally. Tommy could feel the names pressing into his chest now, every time he tried to sleep. Some nights he'd hear voices too, not as loud as Aniello's, but enough. Enough to make him wonder if he was already too far gone. Weeks passed. The final name on the list was the hardest. Initials, PC, Paul Castellano. Of course, Aniello hadn't spelled it out in the book, but the code was clear. Paul had been behind everything. The pressure, the hit, the slow mental unraveling. Aniello hadn't died in peace. He'd died silenced. And now it was up to Tommy to unsilence him. But hitting Paul Castellano wasn't like hitting an old man in a diner or a jogger on a trail. Paul was protected, surrounded, guarded, respected, untouchable. Unless... Tommy remembered something Aniello once said while playing cards one night. The one place a man drops his guard, at the table. Steak in front of him, glass in his hand, laughter in the air. That's when he forgets he's mortal. And Tommy knew where Paul ate. A steakhouse in Midtown, every Thursday night. Table in the back, no coat. 2 bodyguards, big laugh, big ego. Tommy spent a week planning, studying, learning the layout, the exits, the guards, the patterns. He bought a suit, shaved his face clean. Looked like any other Wall Street kid walking in for a power dinner. But he didn't sit. He walked straight to the back, one hand in his coat pocket. The hostess tried to stop him. Sir, you can't... Bang. Not the hostess, the guard, then the other, then Paul. 3 shots, blood on the table, steak untouched, wine spilled, panic everywhere. Tommy dropped the gun and walked. Outside, sirens were already closing in. He knew he wouldn't make it far, but he didn't care. The ledger was complete, and Aniello's ghost was quiet now. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Tommy smiled. He held the book to his chest and whispered, "Rest now, old man. It's done." The sirens were already screaming. By the time Tommy reached the corner of 46th and 3rd, a wall of flashing red and blue had swallowed the street. Squad cars, unmarked units, paramedics. He didn't bother running. What was the point? There were too many of them, and he wasn't even trying to live through this. But they didn't shoot him. They could have. He had just executed Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family, in the middle of a midtown steakhouse like it was an item on a checklist. The gun was still warm in his pocket when they tackled him to the pavement. He expected fists, kicks, maybe a knee on his throat. But what he got was silence. Cuffs. Gloved hands lifting the black book from his coat. And then the sound of someone whispering, "We got him." Tommy didn't speak. Not when they dragged him to the car. Not when they read him his rights. Not even when they shoved him into the cold seat of a transport van and drove him off into the city night like he was just another loose brick in the wall. He sat still, eyes forward. One name left on Aniello's list, his own. Rikers Island. That's where they sent him. Didn't take long. The press went nuts. Gunman kills mob boss in midtown execution. Dellacroce's ghost, revenge hit, or suicide mission? Is the mob crumbling? And behind every headline, one photo. Tommy being hauled out of the steakhouse, blood on his collar, eyes blank as concrete. They put him in solitary. Not for punishment, for protection. Because if the feds didn't keep him alive, he'd end up like Paul. Or worse. His first 3 days inside, he didn't sleep. Not a second. He just sat on the edge of the steel cot, staring at the wall, remembering the sound of each bullet. Bang, bang, bang. He replayed Aniello's last words over and over in his head. "Tell my daughter." I remembered. He hadn't yet, and now he wasn't sure he'd ever get the chance. On the 5th day, a man in a blue suit came to see him. FBI, tall, gray hair, sharp jaw, no smile. He slid a folder across the table between them. "Thomas Marsetti," the agent said. "Born in Queens. Father did 12 years for racketeering. You bounced around from numbers running to collections to driving for Dellacroce. Then you vanish for 3 months and come back just in time to kill Paul Castellano." Tommy didn't answer. The agent leaned in. "You want to know what I think?" Tommy looked at him. "Just barely. I think you were his last soldier. I think Aniello gave you a mission, a one-man war to finish what he couldn't. You're not a hitman. You're not a boss. You're a message. And we heard it loud and clear." Still, Tommy said nothing. The agent sat back and crossed his arms. "Here's the deal. You cooperate with us. Names, places, operations. We keep you alive. We move you. New identity, fresh start, maybe even a second chance." Tommy blinked. "I already had my second chance," he said quietly. "And I gave it to someone else. They left him alone after that. Didn't push, didn't beat him, didn't throw him in general population. They knew what he was now, a symbol, and symbols had power. Especially in a world where old legends like Aniello Dellacroce were starting to die out. One night, a guard brought him a package, no return address. Tommy opened it slowly. Inside, a photo, a postcard, a folded letter. The photo was of a woman, mid-40s, dark hair, standing in front of a college campus with 2 kids and a man beside her, Aniello's daughter. The postcard was blank except for 4 words. He remembered, "Thank you." The letter was longer. "My name is Elena Dellacroce. My mother told me who my father was when I was 17. I didn't understand then. I thought she was ashamed. Now I know it was grief. Pain comes in many shapes. Silence is one of them. I don't know what you meant to him. I don't know what you did. But if he trusted you with this much, then you were more than just a soldier. You were his absolution." Tommy folded the letter with shaking hands. For the first time in weeks, he let himself cry. Not hard, not loud, just a single tear. Sliding down the same cheek that once pressed against the cold window of a getaway car. Time passed. The trial came. It was short, open and shut. Murder won. No defense, no plea bargain. Tommy didn't speak once. The prosecutor called him a vigilante, a madman, a relic of a dying breed. The media painted him as a tragic orphan of the underworld. A ghost gun, they called him. Something created by shadows and guilt. He was sentenced to life, no parole. But that wasn't the end. Because word of what he'd done, the ledger, the list, the hits, it spread. From Brooklyn to Jersey, from Queens to Miami. Guys started whispering his name in barbershops, diners, street corners. Kid took out Paul, Dellacroce's last hit. Real old school. Went down like a soldier. It wasn't praise, it was warning. That the old code wasn't dead yet. That ghosts still moved through the city, tying up loose ends. And in prison, Tommy became a myth. The young guy who stared down the commission. The guy who walked into a steakhouse with a dead man's will and made history. Even lifers gave him space. They didn't talk to him much, didn't joke around, because they could see it in his eyes. He wasn't scared of dying. He already had. He spent his days reading books Aniello had once mentioned. Dostoevsky, Hemingway, Malraux. At night, he wrote in a fresh ledger, one he made from torn scraps and stitched cardboard. But this one didn't list names. It listed truths, hard truths, bloody truths, things he wished someone had told him before he ever said yes to the life. And once a month, he mailed a copy of those pages to Elena. 10 years passed. Tommy's hair grayed, his hands stiffened. But the fire in his chest never went out. One day, a young inmate asked him, "You ever regret it?" Tommy looked up from his bunk. "Which part?" "All of it. Killing Castellano, doing life, following that guy, Dellacroce." Tommy thought for a moment, then he said, "Every day." The kid nodded, disappointed. Tommy looked at him. "But I'd do it all again." "Why?" Tommy closed his eyes. "Because some men are born cursed. But some curses can be broken. You just have to bleed for it." The kid didn't get it. But one day, he would. The first time Tommy saw Aniello in prison, he wasn't sure if it was real. It was 3 months after his sentencing. He had just returned from the yard, another silent walk in the cold sun under the cracked sky, surrounded by killers who no longer had anything left to protect. His body ached. His mind was numb. The concrete walls of the cell looked narrower than usual, and just as he sat down on the metal bunk, ready to pass out from exhaustion, he saw him. Aniello Dellacroce, sitting on the other bunk, same black wool coat, same hollow eyes, same silence. Tommy didn't speak, just stared. Aniello looked at him, then tilted his head. "You're not sleeping." Tommy blinked. "I'm in prison." "So was I," Aniello said, "long before they locked the doors." Tommy wiped his face with his palm. "You're not real." Aniello didn't answer, just stood up slowly, like smoke rising from a match. "You think you're free now? You think finishing the list gave you peace?" "I didn't do it for peace," Tommy muttered. "Then what did you do it for?" Aniello asked. "Legacy? Revenge? My approval?" Tommy didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't know anymore. For a while, Tommy thought he might be losing his mind. Not because he saw ghosts that had started long before Rikers. It was because the ghosts talked back. And not just Aniello. One night, while washing his face in the rust-stained sink, he looked up and saw Paul Castellano behind him in the mirror. His suit was still soaked in wine and blood. "You proud of yourself, kid?" Paul hissed. "You think you did something noble? You were a pawn, just like I was, just like Aniello." Tommy turned, fists clenched, but no one was there. When he looked back into the mirror, the blood had vanished. On the surface, prison had become routine. Tommy kept his head down, ate when they told him, moved when they barked, wrote when he could, read obsessively. Mostly the same authors Aniello once mentioned: Camus, Solzhenitsyn, Baldwin. He filled notebook after notebook, not with confessions or names, but with warnings, life lessons, regrets, raw truths about the mob, about power, about what happens when a man trades his soul for loyalty. And he mailed every page to Elena Dellacroce, once a month. No reply. Not that he expected one. Some things didn't deserve forgiveness, and he'd stopped asking for it. But still he kept writing. He called it the final ledger. The prison had its politics, like any place full of broken men. The Italians kept to themselves. The blacks ran the yard. The Aryans occupied the weight benches. Latinos had their row. Everyone kept a fragile kind of peace. the kind that lasted until someone bumped into the wrong guy or used the wrong word. Tommy didn't belong to anyone, not anymore. He wasn't a made man, he wasn't a civilian either. He was something in between. They called him Ghost, not to his face, but in whispers. He's the one who shot Paul, Dellacroce's shadow. Don't look him in the eye. Most left him alone, out of fear or respect, or both, except for one. His name was Marvin Moose Langston, big guy, quiet. Life sentence for a triple homicide down in Staten Island. Former enforcer for a Harlem crew before everything fell apart. Moose was the kind of man who didn't believe in luck, God, or karma. Only two things mattered to him: silence and survival. And yet one day, he approached Tommy during the evening meal, sat down across from him, just like that. Tommy looked up from his tray. "You lost?" Moose didn't smile. "Used to run collections for a guy who answered to your guy," he said. "Back in '94, Dellacroce." Tommy paused. "You're too young for that." "I was 14, Moose said. "They used me to pass notes, deliver envelopes. They liked how invisible I was." Tommy leaned back. "You a fan?" "No," Moose said. "I'm a witness." Tommy squinted. "To what?" "To the old world, before everything turned into chaos, before everybody started flipping for a reduced sentence." He leaned closer. You didn't flip. You walked into hell and brought your own fire." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You here to give me a gold star?" "No," Moose said. "I'm here to tell you something." Tommy looked around. "Go on." "I heard from one of the COs, Moose whispered. "You got a visitor. Been coming here every 2 weeks, asking to see you. Never leaves a name." Tommy froze. "Male?" he asked. "No, female. Brown hair. Late 40s. Couldn't see much." Tommy swallowed hard. "Eleanor." "Had to be. But why not leave a message? Why not write back? Unless she was just watching. Just looking at the man who walked her father into death." The next day, the warden called Tommy to his office. "Someone finally approved your visit," he said. "You want it?" Tommy hesitated. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside in nearly a year, but something in him said yes. The room was plain. White walls, 2 chairs, plexiglass window between them, phone on either side. She walked in slowly, wore a gray coat, no makeup, hair tied back. Tommy recognized her instantly. Aniello Dellacroce. She sat down, picked up the phone, didn't speak. Tommy lifted his receiver. "Hi," he said, voice low. She studied him like a professor sizing up a lie. "You're thinner than I imagined," she said. Tommy gave a sad smile. "Prison food isn't what it used to be." Elena stared. "You know what I came here to ask?" "I can guess." "Why?" Tommy leaned back. "Because he asked me to." "That's not enough." Tommy nodded. "Then I'll give you the rest." He told her everything. From the first day he drove Aniello to the first body, to the dreams, the ghosts, the ledger, the hits, the blood, all of it. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't leave anything out. When he finished, she was pale, eyes glassy, hands trembling, but she didn't cry. "My father," she said slowly, "was a man I never really knew. My mother loved him once. She told me stories, some good, mostly bad. I spent my whole life trying to rewrite him in my head." Tommy lowered his voice. "I think he did too." They sat in silence. Then she said, "Do you dream of him?" Tommy nodded. "Almost every night." "What does he say?" "He asks me if I'm tired yet." She blinked. "And what do you say?" Tommy swallowed. "I say, not yet." After that, she visited once a month, never stayed long, sometimes just 5 minutes. But every time she came, Tommy slept that night. A full night. No ghosts, no voices, just silence, the kind that felt earned. One day, years later, she brought a small box. Inside, a photograph of Aniello as a young man, black and white, smiling, holding a baby girl in his lap. Tommy stared at it for a long time. "Was that a good day?" he asked. Elena nodded. "One of the only ones." Tommy gave a tired smile. "I'll keep it," he said. She nodded, and he did. Time didn't move in prison the same way it did outside. Out there, clocks were fast. Days slipped through your fingers like sand. People hurried past each other, staring at phones, racing toward something they couldn't even name. In here? Time sat with you. It stared you down. It listened to your breathing. It waited for you to blink before it blinked back. Tommy had stopped counting the days. He didn't have to anymore. It had been over 12 years since he pulled the trigger on Paul Castellano and let the weight of Aniello Dellacroce's past come crashing down on his shoulders. The newspapers stopped writing about him. The whispers in the yard faded. Even the guards stopped calling him Ghost. Now, to most people here, he was just Tommy, a quiet inmate who read more than he spoke, ate what was given to him, rode every night with the lights dimmed low, and nodded to those who deserved respect. But those who'd been inside long enough, the ones who remembered what the streets were like when names like Gambino, Colombo, and Lucchese still carried thunder, they still gave him space. Because even if the world outside had moved on, they knew what he'd done. They knew whose blood had stained his hands. And no matter how quiet a man became, some sins still echoed. There was a new CO on the unit now. Young guy. Brooklyn accent, tight haircut, like he still believed in the badge on his chest. His name was Officer Malley. The first time he saw Tommy, he smirked. "You the one who took down Castellano?" Tommy looked up from his book and gave a soft shrug. "That's what they say." Malley leaned on the bars. "Crazy. My uncle used to work the door at Sparks back in the 80s. Said Castellano used to walk in like he owned the city." "He did," Tommy muttered. "Until he didn't?" Malley chuckled. "Funny how it all ends, huh? Big names, big deals, all dead or locked up." Tommy closed the book. That's the life. It starts with suits and limos and ends with concrete and regrets. Malley tilted his head. "You regret it?" Tommy stared at him. Every second. At night, Tommy still wrote, but the tone of his writing had shifted. He no longer wrote about vengeance, or retribution, or guilt. Now, he wrote about understanding, about clarity, about the cancer of loyalty when it's used to keep men obedient, not honorable. He wrote about Aniello, not the monster, not the legend, but the man. He wrote about the silence that haunted Aniello, the weight he carried, the way his past followed him like smoke from a slow-burning fire. He wrote about Frankie, about Eddie Santucci, about Sal, about Joey Vento, about the men whose names sat inside that ledger like tombstones with no flowers. And through every sentence, every line, Tommy tried to do one thing Aniello never could. Tell the truth. Not the gangster truth, not the courtroom truth, but the raw, painful, bleeding truth. One day, Officer Malley came back, different this time. No smirk, just a man holding something behind his back. "Got a letter for you," he said. Tommy looked up. "From who?" Malley shrugged. "No return name, just initials. AD." Tommy's chest went still. Malley handed him the envelope through the bars and walked off. Tommy stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, one photo. One handwritten note. The photo was of a grave. Simple. Clean. A black headstone with silver lettering. Aniello Dellacroce, 1914 to 1985. Loyal until the end. But underneath, someone had etched something newer into the base. Let the ghosts sleep. The note was in different handwriting. Softer. Feminine. Tommy recognized it instantly. Elena. "I went to visit him this week. The real him. The man in the ground. For years I refused. I told myself I didn't need to stare at a rock to remember the man who ruined my childhood. But lately, I've started to understand why he couldn't let go. Why he looked for a version of himself in you. He didn't want you to become him. He wanted you to survive him. And somehow you did. I think you deserve to rest now, too." Tommy folded the letter slowly. His hands trembled, not from sadness, but from relief. A relief that dug deeper than anything he'd felt in years. It was like the air in the cell had changed, like the walls had backed off a little, like the ghosts had stepped away from his bed and sat down. He laid back on the cot, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept. Weeks passed, spring came. Even in prison you could feel the change, in the wind, in the light, in the way the cold didn't bite quite so hard. Tommy started mentoring younger inmates, guys who came in hot and stupid, guys who thought respect came from stabbing someone in the showers or mouthing off to guards. He didn't lecture them. He told stories about Aniello, about Frankie, about what happens when you confuse fear for respect. One night, a kid named Rico, barely 20, in on a weapons charge, sat next to him in the library and asked, "Why'd you stay loyal to a dying man?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Because he looked me in the eye when nobody else did. And in this life, that matters." Rico nodded slowly, then asked, "Do you think he was a good man?" Tommy closed the book in front of him and stared down at his hands. "No," he said. "But I think he was trying to be one when it was already too late." Years kept slipping by. Tommy's hair turned fully gray. His eyes dimmed, but his hands stayed steady. He stopped writing the ledger, not because he ran out of things to say, but because he'd said enough. The last entry read, "There's no redemption, there's only truth. And if you're lucky, someone left alive to carry it." One morning, Tommy didn't wake up. Guard found him in bed. Peaceful, no pain, just gone. Gone the way Aniello had wanted to go, on his terms. Quiet, alone, finished. They found one thing beside his pillow. The photo Elena gave him, the one of Aniello holding her as a baby. Taped to the back was a note. "Ghosts don't sleep, but sometimes they go home." The warden approved his burial request. No fancy tomb, no headlines, just a box in a quiet plot outside a Catholic cemetery in upstate New York. 3 people attended. 1, Elena, standing in black, holding her children's hands. 2, Moose, older now, grayer, quieter, but still respectful. 3, Officer Malley, who removed his cap and stood in silence. No priest, no eulogy, just a wooden box. And the wind. After everyone left, Elena stayed behind. She knelt beside the grave, pulled out the old black ledger Tommy had sent her in pieces over the years, and buried it, right next to him. Then she whispered, "You kept your promise. You remembered. And now, you can rest." It was cold again in the yard. Not the kind of cold that came from winter or even from the wind. It was a deeper cold, a quiet, sharp stillness that settled around Tommy Marsetti's bones and reminded him that time doesn't stop, even for those who've already paid the price. It had been over a decade since he walked into that steakhouse and shot Paul Castellano in the chest. More than 12 years since he'd driven north with a dying man whose soul was already halfway gone. 12 years since he held Aniello Dellacroce's ledger in his hands and felt the full weight of a ghost asking for peace. Now, Tommy was just another man in a prison yard, walking slow, head down, eyes calm, hands still steady. No one called him Ghost anymore. That name had faded, like a tag on a wall too long exposed to rain and time. Now, he was just Tommy to most, the quiet lifer who didn't cause trouble, didn't join a crew, and didn't talk unless he meant every word. But inside, something else had been growing. Not regret, that had already taken root years ago. Something different. Stillness. He spent most mornings in the library now, alone, unless one of the younger inmates came around asking questions or pretending to care about books. He didn't mind. Sometimes, when the place was quiet enough, he could hear the old voices. Not loud, not like they used to be. Just murmurs in the corners, like ghosts pacing around the shelves, rereading the past. He'd glance up, expecting to see Aniello standing near the window, arms folded, looking out across the yard with that same look in his eyes, tired but dangerous. But Aniello didn't show up as much anymore. He was quiet now, the ghost finally sleeping. Tommy figured that meant he was doing something right. One Thursday afternoon, a guard named Malley showed up with a box. It was small, plain, no writing on the top, but Tommy knew it was something personal. They didn't give you boxes unless someone on the outside remembered you. Mally handed it over and said, "From your visitor." Tommy's heart paused. Elena. She'd been visiting less in recent years. Not out of bitterness, not even out of distance. Just because time has a way of quieting the things we once screamed about. There was nothing left between them that hadn't already been said. But she still remembered him. That alone meant something. He took the box to his cell, sat on the lower bunk and opened it. Inside was a book, a worn, heavy hardback. The cover was faded. The pages yellowed. Inside the cover was a short handwritten message. "You once told me you were tired of carrying other people's stories. I thought maybe it was time you got to carry your own. E.D." He turned to the first page. It was blank. Then the second. Also blank. It wasn't a book at all. It was a journal. A new one. His. That night, he sat down under the flickering ceiling light and picked up a pen. He stared at the page for a long time before writing anything. When he finally started, it wasn't about blood, or names, or vengeance. It was about silence. What it felt like to sit in a cell and remember the sound of laughter, the way it echoed off linoleum floors, the smell of garlic and smoke from a tiny apartment kitchen in Queens, the look in his mother's eyes the day the cops took his father away, the weight of the last hug he got before his sister left town and never looked back. These were the memories no one ever wrote about, the soft ones, the ones that didn't bleed. Weeks passed. Tommy wrote every night now, not because he had to, but because somehow it felt like he was still alive when he did. And in a place like Rikers, staying alive didn't always mean breathing. It meant remembering who you were when the doors closed. He started talking to the younger guys too, kids who thought a crew was a family and a pistol was a passport. They came to him slowly, like strays sniffing out a quiet porch. He never offered advice. He told them stories instead, stories of real men, not the legends the streets bragged about, men like Aniello, who died in silence with ghosts as his only company, men like Frankie Rizzo, who bled in alleys for trusting the wrong brother. One kid, maybe 19, asked him once, "Why'd you stay loyal to a man who already gave up?" Tommy thought for a moment, then he said, "Because he never gave up on telling me the truth." That shut the kid up. That one stuck around. The yard had changed. Fewer fights, more eyes. The new warden was cracking down, trying to make the place look cleaner than it really was. But Tommy didn't care much about politics anymore. He walked his laps, he ate his meals, he wrote his pages, he didn't ask for early parole, he didn't beg for transfer, he didn't even file for medical when his knee started giving out. This was the ending he'd chosen. But even in endings, life had a strange way of lingering. On the anniversary of Paul Castellano's death, they always knew the date. Even if no one said it aloud, someone left a folded newspaper clipping outside Tommy's cell. No note, no name, just the front page from 12 years ago. The headline, "Mob Boss Executed in Midtown Steakhouse, Suspect Caught at Scene." Tommy stared at it a long time. Then he folded it and burned it in the sink. Some history doesn't need preserving. Then came the letter. A few months after that night, from a law office in Manhattan. He recognized the address. Aniello's old crew used to run envelopes through that building in the 70s. Now it was clean, legit. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single page. Typed. Elena had died. Car crash in Vermont. Single vehicle. Slid on black ice. No drugs, no alcohol. Just one of those cruel turns life likes to take when it thinks you're starting to feel safe. There was a will. And in it, a request. She'd left Tommy something small and strange. A key. They let him out for the funeral. He didn't ask, he didn't expect it. But someone pulled strings. Maybe it was Mally. Maybe Moose, who'd transferred downstate. Maybe nobody. Maybe fate. He was cuffed and shackled, escorted by 2 marshals in suits, but he got to stand at the edge of the cemetery, the same one where they buried Aniello. Same wind, same silence. And just like Aniello, Elena had asked for no prayers, just peace. After the burial, the lawyer met Tommy at the gate. He handed him a tiny safe deposit box number. gave him directions. Her wishes were clear, he said. She wanted you to have this. Tommy nodded once, didn't say a word. Inside the box was a cassette tape, labeled Dad, and a note. I found this in a drawer when I was cleaning out my mother's things. She never told me it existed. I listened once. I thought about burning it. But then I thought, maybe you should hear it. He didn't have a cassette player, not in prison. So he asked, wrote letters, pleaded, found a non-profit that offered therapy resources for long-term inmates. They brought in a counselor with an old boombox, and 2 weeks later, in a concrete room with peeling paint and humming lights, Tommy pressed play. The voice was old, gravelly, careful, but clear. Yelena, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I don't know if I'll ever have the balls to give it to you. I don't know if I'll be alive by the time you're old enough to even care. But I wanted to say something. A pause, a breath. I wasn't good. I wasn't even decent. I killed men who never saw it coming. I bled families dry. I buried loyalty with bullets and then called it business. But I loved you, and I loved your mother. I just didn't know how to be two things at once, a father and a monster. Tommy's eyes were wet now. He didn't wipe them. If someone gives you this tape, I hope they're kind. I hope they're better than me. And I hope you don't hate me so much that you forget the few good parts. I used to sing to you, Italian lullabies. You cried a lot, but you always stopped when I sang. A long pause. Maybe someday, someone will come along and tell you the truth, not the headlines, not the FBI files, the truth. And maybe you'll forgive me, maybe not. I just wanted you to know I remembered. I always remembered. The tape clicked, stopped. Tommy sat there a long time. The counselor didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just gave him the space to feel it. When he stood up, he felt lighter, not forgiven, not free, but understood. Back in his cell, he picked up his new journal, the one Elena gave him, and wrote one last entry. I never wanted to be a father, but you made me one anyway. Not by blood, not by name, but by trust. I'm tired now, not from age, from carrying other people's endings. I think I'm ready to stop. Ghosts don't sleep, but maybe now they'll let me rest. They buried Tommy on a cold Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no priest, no visitors except a quiet prison chaplain and an overworked warden who didn't bother bringing a coat. Just a man in a plain pine box in a wind that felt heavier than it should have. His body was laid to rest in a small plot outside the state facility. No name carved yet, just a wooden marker. They said a proper stone would come later, but by then, nobody would come back to check, except one man, Moose. Now, old and stiff from too many fights and too many years sitting in bad chairs, Moose made the drive 3 hours upstate in a borrowed car, hands wrapped in black gloves. He didn't bring flowers, didn't bring a Bible. He brought a notebook, the last one Tommy ever wrote. Moose had found it hidden under Tommy's cot during a final sweep, and even though no one said it out loud, the guards had left it for him. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew what Tommy had done. Everyone knew who he was. But very few had seen who he became. Moose knelt beside the grave, placed the notebook on top of the fresh dirt, and whispered, "You were the last of the real ones." Then he stood up and walked away. 2 months later, something strange happened. A letter arrived at a small community college in Vermont, addressed simply, Professor Aniello Dellacroce, Department of History. Except Elena was gone, buried now, just like her father and the man who carried him. The department assistant opened it anyway. She meant well. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten page, messy but powerful, like it had been written in a rush and meant to be read slowly. There was no return address, just 3 words at the top. The final ledger. Word started spreading after that, not loudly, not fast, but enough. In bookstores, an anonymous manuscript showed up in New York, handwritten and scanned, passed around like a relic. It wasn't titled, it wasn't published, it wasn't even signed. But those who read it knew it wasn't fiction. It was a confession, a reflection, a warning. It started with, "My name was Tommy Marcetti, and I killed a man because his ghost told me to. But this isn't a story about murder. It's a story about what happens when men forget how to sleep." That was enough to pull people in, especially the ones who knew the history, the mob guys, the ex-feds, the journalists who spent their whole careers chasing shadows and coded names. They read the manuscript and saw names they recognized: Rizzo, Vento, Donati, men who vanished, men who died in strange ways, men whose stories had never been closed until now. And suddenly, the story wasn't just a story anymore. It was evidence, it was closure, and it was legacy. The FBI got their hands on it next, not through raids or wiretaps. Someone mailed a copy to an old agent named Frank Vicini, retired 5 years, now living in Arizona with arthritis and a shaky hand. But Frank had chased Dellacroce for a decade. Paul Castellano, too. He read it in one sitting. Then he called someone. That someone called someone else. And pretty soon, the Bureau opened an archive case they hadn't touched since the late 80s. Meanwhile, somewhere in a cafe in Brooklyn, a journalist named Lena Marquez was reading the same manuscript. She'd been covering organized crime for nearly 15 years. Wrote for the Post, then Rolling Stone, then finally quit the industry when everything turned to clickbait. But when she read the final ledger, she felt something she hadn't in years. Truth, ugly, human, undeniable. She made a decision. She drove upstate, tracked down the prison, and asked to see Tommy's cell. The warden shook his head. "There's nothing left. He didn't have family. Everything's gone." She asked if she could walk through anyway. He let her. She stood in the middle of the tiny concrete room and stared at the bed frame, the scratched walls, the empty desk. She imagined him sitting there, writing, haunted, fading, but never stopping. Back in New York, some of the old heads, the ones who were still alive, started getting nervous. Mikey Trentoni, once a soldier under Paul Castellano, now pushing 90 in a retirement home, read the ledger and turned white. Johnny Bassetti, ex-capo turned halfway house junkie, read it and confessed to 3 murders at a soup kitchen in Flatbush. Said it felt like Aniello had whispered it in his ear. Bobby Blue Ragusa, last known soldier tied to the Donati disappearance, was found dead in his garage with a copy of the ledger clutched in his hands. Suicide, they said. But the note left behind was just 3 words. He remembered everything. It didn't go viral. Not like that. This wasn't TikTok, wasn't a trending hashtag. It moved like a slow wind through forgotten alleys, through cracked phone calls and paper trails and dusty libraries. People read it, passed it on, whispered about it, and every time someone read the last page, they felt the same thing. That this wasn't about a gangster. It was about what happens when a man chooses to carry a story that wasn't his, and writes it anyway. Because the man who wrote it didn't want to be remembered. He wanted the truth to be. Then came the twist no one expected. Elena Dellacroce, long thought to be dead with no children, had a son, Julian, adopted at birth. Raised quietly, didn't carry the name. But when he turned 18, he learned everything. His mother had left a letter and 1 copy of the ledger. He didn't read it right away, didn't want to know. But when he turned 25, something changed. He opened it, read every page, cried 3 times, and then he made a decision. He published it, self-published. No agents, no publishers, just raw scans and a transcript uploaded to a single website with 1 sentence at the top. My grandfather was Aniello Dellacroce. My mother was Elena. The man who saved her soul died in a cage with no name. This is his truth. The website crashed within an hour. Then came the podcasts, the docuseries offers, the Netflix calls, the journalists scrambling to verify. But Julian declined everything. He wasn't selling a story. He was releasing a ghost. And once it was out, it couldn't be buried again. A year later, Tommy's grave got a headstone, paid for by donations from readers, people who'd never met him, never shook his hand, but saw themselves in his pain. It was simple. Black granite, 1 word at the top, ghost, and beneath it, he remembered, so we don't forget. Moose visited once a year after that. He'd bring flowers now, not for Tommy, but for the idea of him. Because some people stop living long before they die, and some people don't really die. They just move into the pages and wait. In a small apartment in Queens, a girl named Gia, 17, sat on her bed and read the final ledger out loud to her brother. She didn't know who Tommy was, didn't care much about the mob, but she knew what it felt like to be forgotten, to carry weight that didn't belong to her. To feel like the only way to survive was to tell someone else's story so hers wouldn't feel so empty. When she finished reading, her brother asked, "Was any of it real?" She thought for a second, then said, "Every part that hurt was." And somewhere, maybe in a quiet graveyard outside the city, maybe in the back of a dusty library, maybe in the space between silence and memory, the ghost of Aniello Dellacroce sat beside the ghost of Tommy Marchetti. No words, no bullets, just rest. Because in the end, even ghosts deserve peace. 5 years later. New York didn't change, not really. The skyline shifted, the faces got younger, the names on the streets turned digital, hollow, fast. But the bones of the city, the bricks, the cracks in the sidewalks, the peeling paint in alleys where bodies once dropped and nobody asked why, they were still there. You just had to look close. Some places carried ghosts like perfume, old pizza joints, laundromats, the back of certain butcher shops. And in a small bookstore off Flatbush, down a crooked side street between a vape shop and a pawnbroker, there was a copy of the final ledger kept behind glass. Not because it was rare, because it had been read so many times by so many hands that the spine had snapped, the pages were fraying, and the last entry had been underlined in 3 different inks. "I never wanted to be a father, but you made me one anyway, not by blood, not by name, but by trust." Julian Dellacroce, Aniello's grandson, had gone back to teaching. No documentaries, no podcast circuit, no crime panels. He didn't want to be the guy people called to tell old mafia stories like they were folklore. He wanted to teach history, not be haunted by it. But the truth followed him. After the ledger went public, students started showing up to his classes not for the credits, but for the story. They asked him questions about the life the way people talk about action movies. Did your grandfather really order hits? Was Castellano as bad as the book says? Do you think Tommy was a killer or a martyr? Julian didn't answer, not directly. He'd tell them, every man is 3 things: who he wants to be, who the world makes him, and who he dies as. That usually shut them up, but not everyone was chasing thrills. Some students stayed after class. Quiet ones, like Gia Marino. She didn't talk much, sat near the back, always in a hoodie, taking notes in the margins of her textbooks, not about war or revolution, but about regret, power, shame. After midterms, Julian found one of her papers tucked inside a returned assignment. It wasn't part of the class. It was titled, "Fathers You Don't Bury." It started like this. My father used to sit on our fire escape at night, smoking Newports and whispering to no one. He was a doorman by trade, a soldier by legacy. He told me nothing, but his silence said everything. I used to think silence was peace. Now I know it's just another kind of war. Julian read the entire piece in one sitting, twice. It wasn't just good, it was honest, raw, like a wound left open on purpose. At the bottom she'd written, I read the final ledger. I think your grandfather died a long time before he hit the water. I think Tommy kept him alive just long enough to say goodbye. He didn't grade it, didn't write feedback. He just folded it and put it in his pocket. That night, he sat in his car for an hour, staring at the empty road, thinking about what it meant to be someone's end and someone else's beginning. Weeks later, he asked Gia to stay after class, not as a professor, just as a man with too many echoes in his head. He asked her why she wrote what she did. She shrugged, said, because I needed to say it to somebody. He nodded. Did your father talk about any of it? She smiled, bitter. He talked through the things he didn't say. You know that kind of silence? Where a man's eyes say everything he's buried? Julian nodded. Yeah, I do. Gia looked at him carefully. You ever think about publishing something yourself? About all of this? Julian shook his head. No, I'm not part of that story. I just inherited the noise. She looked down. Maybe that's the story worth telling. Gia kept coming to office hours, not for grades, just to sit in the quiet and ask real questions. What made Tommy different? Do you think ghosts are real or just memories that punch harder? Why do men only become honest when they're dying? Julian didn't always have answers, but he listened. He told her the parts no one wrote down, how Tommy used to cut his fingernails with the lid of a soup can, how he gave his last book away with a joke and a look in his eye like he knew someone would need it more than him, how he never once asked for a lighter sentence even when they offered it. Gia soaked it all in. Then, one day, she brought a notebook, slapped it down on his desk. I think I'm ready, Julian raised an eyebrow. For what? To tell the story from the side no one's looked at yet. He opened the notebook, read the first line. This isn't a story about gangsters. It's a story about the daughters they forgot to love. The next year, Gia published her own book. It wasn't flashy, didn't sell 1 million copies, but it hit, especially with people who'd lived through the silence of men like Aniello, or grown up in houses where fear had its own chair at the dinner table. The book had no mob names, no hit lists, no blood, just truths, the kind you only write when you've felt them under your skin. Julian wrote the foreword. He ended it with, Tommy thought the story ended with his grave. I think it started with her pen. Meanwhile, in the places that still remembered the old names, the neighborhoods where cousins of cousins still ran backdoor poker games and old men sat on folding chairs watching the world fade, word got around about Gia's book. Some called it soft, some said it was betrayal. But most read it in secret late at night and put it back on the shelf like a confession they weren't ready to say aloud. Because deep down, they knew. The kids remembered. And not in the way they hoped. Gia never met Tommy, never heard his voice, never stood beside Aniello's grave, but she carried their ending in her spine. And when she walked across the graduation stage, clutching a rolled-up degree and a hand-me-down coat, Julian stood and clapped for her like she'd just broken a curse, because she had. That summer, Julian drove upstate, back to the cemetery. Tommy's grave still stood, simple, clean. The stone still read, Ghost. He remembered, so we don't forget. Julian stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, breathing in the quiet. Then, from his coat, he pulled a page, Gia's book, the last chapter. He folded it neatly, placed it at the base of the grave, and whispered, She finished it for you. And then he walked away. They say legacy is what you leave behind, but sometimes it's also what you refuse to carry forward. Tommy carried Aniello's guilt so Elena wouldn't have to. Elena gave her silence so her son could hear himself. Julian gave truth to Gia, and Gia gave voice to everyone who thought they were alone in the ruins. That's how the chain broke. Not with a bullet, not with blood, but with a pen. The book was called Fathers You Don't Bury. Gia never meant for it to catch fire. She wrote it as a whisper, a way to let the pain bleed out in letters instead of fists. She expected it to live in secondhand bookstores and a few late-night college libraries. But the truth, the way she wrote it, cut clean, and people felt it. The first time she realized it had caught on was when she got a letter, handwritten, folded 3 times, no return address. Inside, it just said, I thought I was the only one who grew up in a house where the silence was louder than the gunshots. You gave me permission to feel again. Thank you. No name, just a piece of tape stuck to the bottom corner with an old Gambino crest. One of those cheesy pins guys used to wear in Brooklyn back in the 80s. Part pride, part curse. Gia stared at it a long time. Then burned the letter. Not because she was afraid of it, but because she didn't want to turn her story into someone else's permission slip to stay trapped. The second ripple came further away. Upstate New York, Albany. A case file, decades cold, It was pulled from a forgotten filing cabinet in a courthouse basement by a rookie paralegal who'd read Gia's book on her lunch breaks. The file was tagged Frankie Rizzo, presumed homicide, suspected mob retaliation, no witnesses, no body. In Gia's book, Rizzo's name wasn't used, but the initials were there, FR, and the story, word for word, matched what had once lived only in the margins of FBI memos and a grandmother's screams. The paralegal flagged it, the ADA read it, and 3 months later, the case was reopened, not because they expected justice. Frankie had been gone over 40 years, but because sometimes closure is the only kind of justice left. In a 2-story home in Staten Island, a woman in her 70s named Nina Donati sat on the edge of her bed with a rosary in one hand and Gia's book in the other. Her brother, Emilio, had vanished in 1973. No funeral, no answers. One day he was fixing shoes in their father's shop, the next, gone. Just like that. Everyone said the same thing. He must have pissed off someone, must have said the wrong thing. Did you ever ask around? But no one ever gave her the name. Until she read chapter 6 of Gia's book, the story of a shoemaker with bad timing, the one Aniello broke, the one who never screamed. Nina didn't cry when she read it. She just closed the book and whispered, "I knew it." Then she went into the attic and took out the one picture she still had of Emilio, taped it to the front of the book, and placed it on the shelf, not under biography, not under memoir, but in the corner where she kept her family albums. Because for the first time in 5 decades, her brother had come home, even if only in truth. The biggest ripple came from a man named Louis Trentoni, age 56, a plumber by trade, union, father of 2, lived clean, never got pinched, never carried weight, but his last name carried ghosts. His father, Mikey Trentoni, had been a soldier under Castellano, real old school, the kind who kept his boots shined and his morals blurred. Louis had spent his whole life running from that shadow, didn't talk about his father, didn't tell his kids who Grandpa really was. Just said he worked in security and left it there. But then his daughter, a senior at NYU, brought home Gia's book. "Dad, you ever hear of Tommy Marchetti?" she asked, flipping through the pages. He froze. She read out loud the story of the old man who followed a ghost into the dark and pulled a trigger in a steakhouse. Louis didn't sleep that night. The next day, he drove out to his father's grave. He hadn't been in 15 years. He stood there for a long time, unsure what to say. Then finally, quietly, he said, "I forgive you, but I won't repeat you." Hey, and that was enough. Gia, for her part, didn't know about any of this. She just kept writing. Not always about fathers. Sometimes about girls who grow up with their voices folded into napkins at Sunday dinner. Sometimes about kitchens where the walls remember what the family forgets. Sometimes about rage that comes out quiet, like a hand on your shoulder when you expected a slap. She didn't chase headlines. She turned down the docuseries deals, even ignored a call from the Times who wanted to profile her. She didn't want to become the face of a movement she didn't trust, because truth wasn't a brand, and trauma wasn't content. But one day, she did get a call she answered, from Julian Dellacroce. She hadn't heard from him in a while. He'd gone quiet after the book tour, went back to teaching, maybe moved out of the city. She answered, "Gia." His voice was low, calm. "I found something." "What is it?" "A tape, one of Tommy's. He never gave it to anyone. I think he recorded it in the last month." Gia stood slowly. "What's on it?" Julian hesitated. "I think you should hear it for yourself." They met in a library, not when either of them worked at, just a public branch in the Bronx, neutral ground, quiet. Julian brought an old recorder, set it on the table, pressed play. Tommy's voice came through, aged and dry. "If this gets found, it means I didn't make it out. That's fine. I wasn't trying to. But I want you to know something. If you're listening, then the story didn't die with me. I used to think legacy was about fear, that if people said your name with their heads down, you mattered. But I was wrong. Fear is fast. It dies in a whisper. But truth stays. Truth infects. Truth passes hands like disease, and sometimes it heals. If you're holding this tape, I hope you're not like me. I hope you're better. I hope you tell the story the way it was meant to be told, not as a warning, but as a map. Because the worst part about being a ghost is not being dead. It's realizing how many people you could have saved if you'd just spoken sooner. Silence. Click. End of tape. They sat for a long time. Neither said anything. Finally, Gia broke the silence. He was talking to me. Julian nodded. I think so too. She looked at him. What do I do now? Julian smiled, tired but proud. You keep telling the truth. Later that year, Gia gave a talk at a high school in Queens. Small group, 11th graders, not the usual crowd. She stood in front of them, book in one hand, Tommy's tape in the other. She told them the story, not about gangsters, but about a man who followed a ghost, about a girl who refused to bury silence, about what it means to break a cycle. When she finished, one kid, small, shy, hoodie up, raised his hand. What happened to the ghosts? She paused, then said. They stopped screaming, because someone finally listened. There was one story left. Gia knew it the moment she finished speaking at that Queens high school. The applause was nice, sure. Some of the kids clapped out of politeness, others because they really meant it. But even as she walked out the back exit, gripping her coat against the cold spring wind, something in her chest told her the work wasn't done. She'd written about her father, without naming him. She'd written about silence, without explaining where it lived in her. She'd written about Tommy and Aniello, Frankie and the Ledger, the legacy of men who died too slowly and too loudly. She gave voice to the buried and the forgotten. But not once had she ever said his name. Not once had she faced the one man who started her story long before she knew how to write it. And now, she was done avoiding it. She hadn't seen her father in 17 years. He'd been a quiet shadow in her life for as long as she could remember, present, but never warm. He didn't hit. He didn't drink. He just disappeared into himself. His silence was a second parent in the house, always louder than the radio or the kitchen fan or the fights on TV. She used to listen for the sound of his footsteps coming home from work, counting each one like a clock ticking down to another long night of nothing. Then, one day, the footsteps stopped. No warning, no explanation. He left a check on the table and vanished like smoke. No return address, no apology. Just one sentence scribbled in blue pen on a torn piece of cardboard. Some ghosts have to go missing. Through old court documents and public records, she'd found him. Anthony Marino, age 64, former Gambino associate, never made but loyal enough to be useful. Now living in a rundown apartment complex in Bay Ridge near the docks, retired, alone, off the grid. She stood outside his building for 15 minutes before walking in. She wasn't nervous, just still. Still in that way you get when you already know what's waiting for you. It wasn't fear. It was acceptance. Like she was finally showing up to the last page of a book she'd been rereading her whole life. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. She knocked 3 times, no answer. She raised her hand to knock again, but the door creaked open, slowly, without sound. He hadn't locked it. Inside, the place smelled like old coffee and newspapers. It was dark, shades pulled, TV muted. A fan creaked in the corner like it was breathing. And there he was, her father, older, smaller, bent in a way she didn't remember. He was sitting in a chair by the window, wearing the same kind of white undershirt he used to wear when she was little. Except now it clung to his bones. He looked at her, didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't speak. Just said, I figured you'd come. She stepped inside, closed the door. She didn't sit right away, just stood near the wall, staring at him. I wrote a book, she said. I know, he replied. She raised an eyebrow. You read it? No. Why not? He looked out the window. Because I knew you were telling the truth. That made her chest tighten, not from pain, but from something else. Recognition. Why'd you leave? She asked. No softness, just steel. He didn't flinch. Because every time I looked at you, I saw everything I was too scared to change. You could have tried, she said. I didn't know how, he replied. You didn't even say goodbye. I didn't think I deserved to. That sat in the air like smoke. Neither of them moved. Finally, she stepped forward and pulled a chair from the kitchen, sat across from him, pulled out a small tape recorder and placed it on the table between them. I want to ask you some things. He nodded once. Okay. She clicked it on. Do you know Tommy Marzetti? His eyebrows lifted slightly. Only by reputation. He was Dellacroce's shadow. He finished Aniello's ledger, she said. He shot Castellano, did time, died inside. Her father nodded slowly. I heard. You ever meet Aniello? A pause. I saw him once. I was 18. Delivery boy. Dropped off an envelope to a butcher shop on Flatbush. He was sitting in the back, eating sausage and peppers like it was his kitchen. Never looked up. But I knew it was him. What did you feel? Like I was looking at a wolf in a suit, she smiled faintly. Tommy said Aniello used to talk to ghosts, said they wouldn't let him sleep. Her father looked at her carefully. I believe it, she leaned in. You talk to ghosts? His eyes didn't blink. Every night, the conversation went on for over an hour. She asked questions. He answered most, some with words, some with silence. But for the first time in her life, her father told her stories. Real ones. About growing up in a house where fear was passed down like dishes. About learning to lie before he learned to drive. About the first time he held a gun and how it shook in his hand until someone told him, "You aim better when you don't care what happens." About the night he found out Emilio Donati had been buried in a hole outside Jersey, and how he went to church the next morning just to sit in the back and ask God what kind of men they were becoming. And then he told her the truth about her childhood, the deals, the paranoia, the business trips that were really quiet beatings in motel rooms, the reason the hallway light always stayed on, not for her safety, but to signal him when it was safe to come in. And finally, the guilt, not over what he'd done, but over what she had to carry because of it. I didn't want to poison you, he said softly, so I left. You were the poison, she replied. He nodded. I know. By the end, they didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just sat in the quiet, the kind that had once killed them, and finally let it be honest. Gia stood to leave. He didn't stop her. As she reached the door, she turned and asked, You remember the last thing you ever said to me? He looked up. Some ghosts have to go missing. She nodded. Yeah. Then added, But they don't have to stay that way. She left. Back home, she replayed the tape. Only once. Then she erased it. Not because she wanted to forget, but because some truths were meant to be felt, not filed. 2 weeks later, she got a package in the mail. No name, no return address. Inside, a cassette tape. An old photograph. The photo was from 1981. A young man, her father, standing on a rooftop with a group of other guys. Most had cigarettes in their mouths. Her father was the only one with his hands in his pockets. On the back, someone had written, Before the Ghosts. The tape had only one thing recorded on it. I'm sorry. She kept both, but never played the tape again. That fall, she gave a lecture at a university in Boston. The room was packed. Not just students, professors, reporters, locals. She talked about memory, about inheritance, about the difference between stories and wounds. At the end, someone asked, Do you think we'll ever stop glorifying the mob? She smiled. No, but I think we'll learn to tell the truth under the myth. Afterward, a student approached her, said her grandfather had died in a warehouse in '74. No charges, no closure. I think I read about him in your book, she whispered. Gia didn't promise answers. She gave her a copy of the final ledger instead. Start here, she said. He's in there, somewhere. At night, Gia sat on her fire escape, notebook in her lap. She didn't write much anymore. But sometimes she just needed to sit under the city sky and remind herself that ghosts could fade too, if you gave them a name, a voice, and the freedom to rest. And now, they had all three. Gia used to think healing came quietly, like grief softened over time, like the ghosts got quieter, the deeper you buried them. But she was wrong. Healing came loud, not in sound, but in pressure. It pushed on your ribs, pulled on your spine, shoved the memories into your face when you least wanted to see them, and it didn't wait for permission. It just showed up. Like the letters, like the emails, like the inbox that kept piling up with names and dates and broken timelines from strangers she'd never met. After her Boston talk, things changed. The tape with her father never left her desk drawer, but she stopped thinking about it every day. It became a weight she could carry, not one she had to drag. She returned to New York with a plan, not to write another book, not yet, but to create something real, something useful, a space for people like her, not victims, not martyrs, not children of crime or footnotes in mob memoirs, just people who grew up in the shadow of things they weren't allowed to name. She called it the quiet room. It started small, one room in the back of a public library in Queens. Once a week, no cameras, no press, no expectations. The rules were simple. 1, you didn't have to say your name. 2, you didn't owe anyone your story. 3, but if you told it, tell it straight. The first meeting had 5 people. A retired corrections officer who'd once escorted Tommy Marzetti between courtrooms and still had dreams of the man's eyes. A social worker whose father disappeared in 1986 after running errands for some guy named Richie No-Neck. A woman whose mother was Aniello Dellacroce's niece, raised on rules, rosaries, and threats. A teenage boy whose uncle did time with a guy named Vento and used to brag about it until he drank himself into silence. And Gia. No introductions, no structure, just a circle, coffee, chairs that creaked, and stories that had waited decades to be spoken. Gia didn't moderate, she just sat, listened. And after a while, they didn't talk about the mob, they talked about mistrust. About waking up with a knot in your stomach every day for no reason. About how fear didn't leave scars, it taught silence. That first night, nobody cried. But everyone exhaled in a way they hadn't in years. And that was enough. By the 3rd month, they had to move rooms. Now it was a dozen people, then 20. Then someone brought donuts. Someone else donated folding chairs. Another left behind a letter that just said, "I don't have the words yet, but I'll keep coming until I do." The press found out eventually. A local columnist wrote a piece. Mob legacy survivor hosts quiet support circle in Queens, reclaims trauma without glorifying it. Gia hated the title, but the message stuck. More people came. Not all of them had direct ties to the mafia. Some had grown up with cops who looked the other way. Some had fathers who were bookies. Some had mothers who kept closets full of secrets. All of them knew what it meant to grow up in silence. One night, an older woman named Dolores came in late. She was in her 70s, elegant, tired. She didn't sit. She stood near the edge of the room, arms crossed tight. Then she said, "I used to iron Paul Castellano's shirts." The room went still. Never spoke to him, but I watched the way his wife never looked anyone in the eye. That was the first time I understood how power really worked. It doesn't shout, it whispers. She sat down, didn't speak again, but kept coming back. Another night, a young man, early 20s, hoodie pulled low, said, "My uncle used to tell me stories about the hits like they were bedtime tales. He made murder sound like purpose. I used to be proud of that, until I had a kid of my own." And realized I had nothing to pass down but noise. That night, everyone stayed late. No one wanted to go home. Gia started taping some of the sessions, with permission, not to post, not to profit, just to remember. Because these weren't stories being told, they were exorcisms. Every laugh was survival. Every pause was a scar. Every truth was a body being pulled out of a river no one had searched in decades. She started publishing essays, short ones, no names, just themes. The inheritance of silence, raised by men who were feared. When regret is passed down like furniture, the essays didn't go viral, but they spread. Therapists shared them. Podcasters read from them. One was printed and left in a courthouse waiting room. Gia didn't care about credit. She cared that someone somewhere would read a line and whisper, That's me. One evening, long after a quiet room session had ended, a woman stayed behind, mid-40s, nervous, eyes swollen from holding back tears. She approached Gia, said softly, "My brother's in the book, the final ledger." Gia blinked. "Who?" She hesitated. "Sal." The name hit her gut like ice. Sal D'Amato. The guy Aniello shot in the alley. The kid who'd cracked under pressure. The one whose death haunted Tommy. The one that started it all. Gia stepped back slightly. I'm sorry," she whispered. The woman shook her head. "Don't be. He made choices, but he was still my brother." Gia asked, "Why now? Why come here?" The woman looked around the empty room, then said, "Because no one ever told our side, and I'm tired of pretending I wasn't in the room when the silence started." That night, Gia sat alone. She opened her notebook, wrote only 2 words, "Forgiveness whispers," then closed it. The following week, Julian Dellacroce returned. He sat in the back, said nothing, but Gia saw him. They exchanged a nod, not of reunion, but of understanding. After the meeting, they walked to the corner together. "Still writing?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "You?" "I'm thinking of starting again," she smiled. "About your grandfather?" "No," he replied. "About your generation. You're the ones who survived what we refused to name." They stood in silence under the streetlight. Finally, Julian added, "You ever think we weren't cursed, just unfinished?" Gia exhaled. "Maybe." Years passed. The quiet room became a network. Other cities started versions. Philly, Boston, Detroit, even Chicago. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't justice. But it was real. And real was enough. Gia never tried to become famous, never wrote a second book. But the stories kept coming anyway. In letters, in photos, in confessions that started with, "I've never told anyone this before." She became something she never meant to, a place for ghosts to go. But instead of haunting her, they sat beside her and let her sleep. On the 5th anniversary of the Final Ledger's publication, Gia held an event. Nothing flashy, just a room, a mic, a chair, and a sign on the wall that read, "Let the ghosts rest." People came from across the country. Some spoke, some just sat. One kid, couldn't have been older than 17, got up and said, "My grandfather used to tell me never to ask questions. He said truth got people killed. But tonight, I realized something. Truth also brings them back." Gia sat in the front row, didn't cry, just listened, the way Tommy once did, the way Aniello never got the chance to. That night, back in her apartment, Gia sat on her fire escape again, notebook in her lap, tape recorder beside her. She pressed record, said softly, "I don't know if the ghosts sleep now, but I think they've stopped pacing, and I think that's enough." This story started with a man who couldn't sleep. Then it passed through a man who couldn't breathe without remembering. Then it reached a girl who learned how to name the quiet. I don't know what happens next, but I know it won't be silence. She clicked the recorder off and closed her eyes.